Thanks, everybody. I am going to start by trying to do a little screen sharing here. I would also like to begin with quick thanks to Cheryl and all of the organizers for their Herculean efforts to pull off this conference in very extraordinary times. Thank you guys for showing up to attend. It's been a few years since I have been to the hockey conference, so let me start with a little bit of introduction. My name is John Soares. I teach history at the University of Notre Dame. That's the one in South Bend, Indiana. I'm a former Fulbright visiting research chair at Carleton University in Ottawa. The root cause of my personal interest in hockey is that my father is a former college coach and NHL scout. The less I say about my own playing of hockey, the better. In terms of academic interest, for a while now, I have been working on the intersection of politics and international hockey during the Cold War. I presented at the hockey conferences in Victoria and Buffalo, have a number of publications on the topic, including in journals like Diplomatic History, various anthologies, and the presentation I'm about to share with you developed from an article that is forthcoming in the International Journal of the History of Sports upcoming special issue on the Winter Olympics that should be out for the 2022 Winter Olympics. And I'd add a quick note, as you can see on my screen, my title was intended to be Sapporo, Lake Placid, and Dangerous Relations. Somehow I got that translated into danger in the conference program. Hopefully, I'm not going to be disappointing any of you, but with insufficient drama here. But in terms of the topic, Sapporo, 1972, the United States won an Olympic silver medal in hockey. Most Americans didn't notice or care. The fan-in-chief in the White House, Richard Nixon, merely dispatched a formulaic congratulatory telegram. 8 years later, the situation was very different in Lake Placid. The United States won the gold medal. Americans, even those who didn't ordinarily follow hockey, get very excited. The non-sports fan in the White House invited the team for a visit. My argument is that the difference in these reactions reveals popular American attitudes and views of a policy of détente that I'll explain in a moment, and that these had serious political and diplomatic consequences. To state it bluntly, in 1972, Americans liked and supported détente. By 1979-80, they did not. As a result, they elected Reagan president, which led to the dangerous turn in U.S.-Soviet relations in the early 1980s. Détente was the effort to improve U.S.-Soviet relations and ease Cold War tensions. 1972 was one of its high points. In May, in Moscow, Nixon and Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev signed the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, known as SALT, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the ABM Treaty. They signed a document known by the short title of Basic Principles that was supposed to be governing kind of the rules for détente. And as this was going on, polls showed Americans were very pleased with it in 1972. You can see the numbers, 74% approved, 18% disapproved. This was reflected in part on ice during Sapporo and the events leading up to it. The Soviet coach, Anatoly Tarasov, invited U.S. coach Murray Williamson to visit Moscow in the summer of 1971. Williamson made the visit, took advantage of the opportunity to learn Soviet training techniques, incorporated them into his pre-Olympic preparations. In addition, the Soviets played the U.S. 5 times in pre-Olympic exhibitions, and that's an unusually large number for U.S.-Soviet exhibition games. In addition, each team celebrated the other's win over Czechoslovakia, which the Soviets win helped them to the gold medal. The U.S. win over Czechoslovakia helped them to the silver medal. And there was American-Soviet relations were fairly favorable at this point. As the 70s progressed, détente involved cultural exchanges. Some involved sports teams, in particular hockey. This was a decade that saw the first in a series of previously unimaginable competitions. The 1972 Summit Series was the first ever meeting of Canadian NHL All-Stars against the Soviet national team. It was an 8-game series. The Canadiens won the series in the final minute of the final period of the final game. 1974, there was a successor, USSR Canada Series. A team of Canadians from the World Hockey Association, a rival to the NHL in the 70s, played the Soviets. The WHA team only won 1 game and there were 3 ties. So that was a big win for the Soviets. 1975-76 was the Super Series. 2 Soviet elite league clubs, the wings of the Soviet and the Central Army, each played 4 NHL teams. The Soviet clubs combined for 5 wins and a tie against just 2 losses. 1976 was the first Canada Cup, which is the precursor to today's World Cup. The Canada Cup involved unrestricted rosters of the best players from the best hockey playing countries in the world. Late 1976, in the Izvestia tournament, a prestigious tournament in Moscow, the Winnipeg Jets became the first professional team to participate, and they finished in a disappointing next to last place. And then 1979, the Challenge Cup replaced the traditional NHL All-Star game. The NHL All-Stars played a 3-game series against the Soviets. The Soviets won the third and decisive game 6-0, despite playing their backup goaltender. This demonstrated that the best Soviets were equal to top Canadian pros and helped make the U.S. team that would eventually win gold at Lake Placid look like an even more prohibitive underdog. What also happened as the 70s progressed is that détente increasingly became a source of controversy and criticism. The Helsinki Accords and a second Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, in retrospect, look like significant accomplishments in terms of trying to build peace and stability between the US and the Soviets and in Europe, but were widely criticized in the United States for being too favorable to the Soviets and not enough to the United States. There were problems all over the place. This is mostly a laundry list. The U.S. decided not to proceed with the construction of the neutron bomb and the B-1 bomber. Meanwhile, the Soviets deployed the backfire bomber and a new range of intermediate missiles known as the SS-20s that could hit every NATO capital in Europe. In addition, there were issues in Chile, in Egypt and the Middle East, in Angola, in Ethiopia, and finally, in late 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And collectively, these convinced Americans that détente was increasingly a good deal for the Soviets and not for the U.S. By 1976, Ford had banned the word détente from his campaign speeches. Carter criticized Ford, argued that he was letting the Soviets get the best of him. Carter wanted a more reciprocal détente, and Americans tended to support this. 1976 polling found by 59% to 23%, the Americans favored continuing détente, but those numbers had changed significantly by 1979-80. It was much closer to an even division, with only 45% of Americans approving détente, whereas 41% preferred some kind of revived Cold War. And it's with this sense of hostility to the Soviets, disappointment with détente, combined with other national frustrations, struggling economy, the Iran hostage crisis, meant that many Americans who couldn't tell a butt end from a blade, were delighted, exploded in celebration when the Americans beat the Soviets and won the gold medal in Lake Placid. Flag waving, which had become passé in the Vietnam era, became popular in America again. The USA chant that so many people find annoying and obnoxious and overbearing today began after a decade of frustration and began at Lake Placid. Many Americans, not all of them certainly, but a large enough number to affect politics, were done with détente and post-Vietnam angst. President Carter attempted to capitalize on the team's popularity, hence the invitation to visit the White House. But Reagan was much better able to tap into the political desires of Americans who wanted some kind of national resurgence. And to bring my paper to a conclusion, let me just say that the reaction to Lake Placid showed that Americans wanted resurgence, and they were willing to run some risks to obtain it. Consequently, they turned to a former movie actor who was fond of simple sounding remedies. Reagan thought détente was a mistake that was prolonging the Cold War. He was willing to go on the ideological offensive and pursue confrontational policies for dealing with the Soviets. And that brought us to the dangerous days of what historians call the Second Cold War in the early 1980s. So with that, I will conclude my presentation and pass it on to you, Kristi.
Thanks very much, John. I'm next up, so I'm just gonna start by sharing my screen here. Okay, so thank you. My talk today is entitled Strong Offensive Zone Play, and in fact, this work is been recently published in the American Review of Canadian Studies. It wasn't when I proposed it, but with the delay in the conference, it is now. So as hockey scholars, we tend to believe that hockey provides an important opportunity to examine the ways that sport and national identity both produce and reproduce privileged identities for some and marginalized identities for others. Or as Nathan Kalman-Lamb tells us, Canadian hockey is an arena for the unapologetically naked rehearsal of hegemonic whiteness that persists at the heart of Canadian national identity. Despite this, however, other national contexts, both within the boundaries of the Canadian nation as well as those outside of it, challenge the idea that Canada is hockey. Countries like Russia, Sweden, the United States, as John demonstrated today, all lay some claim to the game. Countries like Russia, who have traditionally played a hockey-type game that actually predates the Canadian version, and other nations have produced world-class hockey players, while Russia included, that have won international championships, often at Canada's expense. Further, unique understandings of hockey intersect with various national cultures from within Canada itself, especially Indigenous, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and Franco-Canadian or Acadian and Quebecois nationalisms. Well, these intersections have the potential to produce new understandings of the game while disrupting, resisting, and of course reconfiguring hegemonic Canadian nationalism and its related on-ice play. In the work I'm discussing here, I suggest that it's important to bring an analysis of hegemony to discussions of Canadian hockey nationalism. Although there's value in pointing out how hegemonic Canadian hockey produces privileged identities, and I've done this throughout my career, specifically those linked to the bodies of seemingly straight, able-bodied young white men, I think it's also important to note that dominant identities are not constructed in isolation from, but actually in conversation with other marginalized forms of national myth-making. By doing this, we can better understand how national identities are both constructed as well as contested, representing the interests of various elites, but also standing as sites of resistance and challenge. The theoretical framing for my work today follows from Gramsci's work on hegemony, but specifically the ways that gender scholars like Dimitritou have picked this up. So Canadian hockey hegemony tells us that hockey is essentially Canadian, that it's a natural outgrowth of our northern climate, and even more importantly, distinct groups argue that the sport joins the country together and creates social cohesion and community. Ron MacLean is one such person, and he says, this is the story of a love affair between a country and a game. It's simple, really, he says. For many of us, it's a sense of belonging. We may be coming from different places, but we're all coming from the same place. And we've seen this attitude echoed in a 2012 Environics survey that found that 80% of Canadians strongly agreed or somewhat agreed that hockey was a key part of what it means to be Canadian. Scholars like Courtney Cito and Nancy Theberge have focused their attention on the ways that Canadian hockey hegemony has worked to mask inequalities and privilege. And I've demonstrated in my own work that young men and boys elite level hockey in Canada produces a narrow understanding of appropriate hockey play, linked to a sense of national identity that works to marginalize those others, including women and non-North American hockey players who will not or cannot play hockey in a way that favors a commitment to aggressive physicality. However, my work with former Canadian Hockey League players who'd come from Europe and Russia to play in the CHL also shows that hockey is meaningful and important beyond Anglo-Canadian practices. European players stress that although Canadian hockey was played with similar rules on similar rinks, the game they learned at home was unique and represented important national differences. Sergei explained, "I had the feeling that my European style can help me, because I know some combinations, some passes, some Russian passes, and things which Canadians are not usually doing." Although the European game is marginal in Canada, the players that I had spoken to didn't give up their own game and understood it in ways that challenged Canadian hockey hegemony, even while playing in Canada. As new rules develop to protect player safety and mathematical modelings of best practices begin to become more common, elite teams are beginning to value new ways of selecting hockey players, altering hegemonically celebrated styles of play. Therefore, it's not surprising that external challenges to the supremacy of Canadian hockey nationalism have shifted state, public, and media understandings of the game and the significance of European players to it, understanding and the significance of European players to the game. Numerous scholars have pointed out the significance of hockey to French Canada and particularly Quebec identities as well. Jean Harvey argues, and I quote, "In the first half of the 20th century, then French Canadians enthusiastically took up hockey and made it a symbol of their national identity, their fight for survival, and the survival of their culture." For Harvey, the link between Quebec culture and hockey is one characterized by resistance, not assimilation. This culture of resistance has been celebrated within Quebec popular culture, with the tensions between English and French Canada exemplified by the rivalry, and we've seen this as recently as just a few weeks ago, or I guess last week, between the Montreal Canadiens and the Toronto Maple Leafs. In my own work with old-timers hockey players, I found that it's not only Quebec nationalism that's expressed through hockey, but Acadians also express their unique commitment to culture, language, and identity through their participation in the sport. For example, a 63-year-old research participant and old-timers hockey player, Jean-Charles, explained that in his primarily Anglophone community, he started his own Acadian hockey team in order to play and be with other Acadians. He said, "When you're looking at a minority in any language, there's a tendency to remain within your own group. The reality is you put one Anglophone on a Francophone group and then the Francophones will basically speak English. For me, it's very simple. When the game is over, it's the social part. It's not only about hockey." In this regard, hockey for both Quebecois and Acadians is an important cultural space to practice, to celebrate, and to challenge what Eva Mackey calls Canadian identities, asserting instead the importance and value of their unique national positions. For some Indigenous peoples in Canada, hockey is culturally significant as well, a practice that existed prior to colonialism and has continued today. This disrupts white origin stories often associated with Canadian hockey, even as non-Indigenous actors represent hockey as a Canadian practice developed by settlers. Indigenous actors and their histories are often resistant to these claims. For example, although hockey origin stories might suggest that the birthplace of hockey is Montreal, Kingston, Ontario, Windsor, Nova Scotia, etc., Bennett argues that the much more likely explanation for hockey's development and growth in colonial Canada is its historic existence as an Indigenous game, developed simultaneously in several different communities and brought to settler Canada through contact between Indigenous peoples and settlers. Indigenous players today affirm hockey's meaning in their own communities, and we've seen this throughout the conference, actually. Michael Robideau's ethnographic work on hockey tournaments in Indigenous communities across Canada demonstrates the unique meanings and identities that Indigenous people bring to the game. In one poignant example, Robideau describes his experience conducting fieldwork in Estimik First Nation in British Columbia. He noted the ways that the players privileged flair, something strictly sanctioned as inappropriate in elite level men and boys Anglo-Canadian hockey culture. The team he watched, he also commented that they lacked this kind of stifling rationalization often associated with modern sport in Canada. When Robideau approached the chief asking him about the relationship between sport and marginalization, he replied quite simply, "I don't see it as assimilation if we do it in a better way." Robideau's work is only just one example of the unique cultural and symbolic meanings that various Indigenous participants bring to the game and the important ways that they disrupt colonial discourse and understandings of modern sport in Canada. Accounts like his present an important challenge to hockey's hegemonic position as the symbol of Canadian nation, demonstrating the ways that Indigenous hockey exists as separate from, but also in conversation with non-Indigenous versions of the sport. The stories of those internal and external national others who participate in Canadian hockey teach important lessons, demonstrating that others conceptualize the sport of hockey differently. Although today I focus my analysis on European, Franco-Canadian, and Indigenous identities, the lessons learned here, I think, can help explain other internal and external challenges to the game that are posed by an even wider variety of others, including women, gender and sexual minorities, the disabled, the racialized, and the old, to name only a few. Specifically acknowledging these challenges to the hegemony of a singular Canadian hockey nationalism, one specifically tied to the bodies of Anglo white young men in Canada, helps to demonstrate the ways that more privileged identities shape themselves in discussion with and in contradiction to more marginalized versions of the game. And that's it. Thank you. All right. Thank you. Next up, we have Madison Danford.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I'm zooming in from Kingston, Ontario, the traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. I understand that I am an uninvited guest on this land, and my ability to inhabit these spaces came at a direct cost to Indigenous communities. As you'll notice, my title has changed since I first submitted this abstract, which now feels like years ago. Today, I'll be sharing my larger PhD thesis, some broad research questions that I have, and some preliminary data that I'm excited to learn more about. This is a work in progress, and I'm still working through a lot of the logistics before I move into writing my proposal. So I grew up in rural Ontario, where the arena is usually the epicenter during the winter months. In fact, my first steps as a toddler were taken in the foyer of my home rink. My small town, like many small towns across Canada, have this perception that it could be named Hockeyville. And as such, I am intimately familiar with the threads of white nationalism that underlie the Canadian hockey culture. To this end, my larger project aims to explore the ties between predominantly white, rural Canada and hockey culture through Kraft Hockeyville's competition. So since 2006, the multinational corporation Kraft has awarded a total of $3.8 million to 85 communities across Canada for local hockey renovations via their yearly competition. Kraft's Hockeyville is a national competition where communities compete to receive $250,000 for arena upgrades and a visit from 2 NHL teams for a preseason game. The competition is open to all communities across Canada, inviting community members to create a rally page and submit a video stating why their community deserves to be crowned Kraft Hockeyville. The videos and rally pages are judged by a panel, which consists of sponsors, NHL and NHLPA representatives to determine the top 4 communities. The top 4 communities are then announced, and their videos are shared for Canada-wide voting. So according to Stats Canada, 12 of the 14 communities that have won Kraft Hockeyville are over 90% white, whereas Canada represents about 70% white. This year was in fact the first time that an Indigenous community has won or even made it to the top 4 in the competition's history. Considering that hockey has long been identified as a white Canadian game by many scholars such as Adams, Allain, Cormick, Krebs, Pitter, Cito, and many more, this is unsurprising. The perception and the production of hockey as Canada's national identity constitutes this idea of an imagined community as suggested by Anderson in 1983, where the creation of the national identity occurs during a process of communal imagination. These perceptions often depict Canada as a nation of small towns, when in reality, the majority of Canada's population live in population centers over 30,000 inhabitants. Small towns used to be known for producing NHL players in Canada, which definitely plays into this perception. However, in a recent study, this isn't the case anymore, as majority of NHL players in Canada come from larger urban centers. Hockey doesn't live in small towns anymore, yet these perceptions still do. Allain 2015 has explained that these imagined Canadian perceptions are often articulated through hockey and linked to white, masculine, working class, blue collar, small town Canada, you know, the average Joe. Thus, if this is the evented state of the nation, I question, where does this leave Black, Indigenous, and people of color in Canada? So Kraft Hockeyville's mission statement says, Kraft Hockeyville is a competition that aims to rally people together and help protect the future of hockey in Canada, because communities build hockey and hockey builds communities. And this is what I'm really interested about diving into and looking at. So for my future project, I'd be interested in exploring questions such as these. What communities are Kraft Hockeyville building? So geographically, demographically, socioeconomically, what are these communities? What specifically is Kraft Hockeyville hoping to protect? And I question if Kraft Hockeyville reproduces this nostalgic connection between whiteness, rural communities, and hockey as a representative of what it means to be Canadian, where does this leave racialized and urban communities in Canada? This dream that hockey represents the entirety of Canada is a popular Canadian fiction that doesn't accurately represent Canada's contemporary dynamics. Additionally, within my analysis, I'd be interested in tracking what happens to the prize money, who ultimately benefits from the arena upgrades, and by extension, who is excluded. There seems to be very little follow-up or knowledge known about the impact and outcomes within the community preceding the event, once Kraft packs up, passes over the check, and moves on. My neighboring town won Kraft Hockeyville Grand Prize when I was younger. I remember and still continue to hear the stories, and we can see the ramifications of the event within the town. I saw how the event initially brought a lot of the community members together through the parades and rally events, etc. However, after the big check was passed over, it ultimately led to a divide within the town because some community members wanted the money spent in different ways. There's still major tension within this community, and this community won more than 10 years ago. You can see directly who benefited from the financial upgrades within the arena and who didn't. And I'm curious to see if this is consistent across the other communities as well. So now I'm going to shift gears a little and present a little bit of my preliminary data. I conducted a critical discourse analysis on the 2019 top community videos. So these are the videos that get circulated for Canada-wide voting. We see them in social media, Hockey Night in Canada, etc. So I examined the discourse that were detected in the videos, analyzing the audio and visual dialogue from each of these top 4 communities. There was this prevailing theme of the arena and the role that these spaces assume within each of the communities. The language that is used in each of these videos suggests that the arena is the thing that is holding the community together. The commonality of this discourse implies that without the arena, the community would not survive. One community member said, and quote, "The arena was the heart and soul of this place, and it's what keeps our community going and thriving," end quote. Another community referred to the arena as the lifeblood of the community. Each of the submission videos compares the arena and an inanimate structure used to facilitate recreational activities to the function of life. One community shared that the arena is the focal point of our community that brings all of us together as a family. However, we can use Anderson's 1983 explanation that these ideologies are imagined because, quote, "the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them. Yet in the mind of each lives the image of their communion," end quote. In the minds of many, the arena and hockey bring the community together, establishing this family feel. As per Kraft Hockeyville's mission statement, communities build hockey and hockey builds communities, thus reinforcing this narrative that without a space to play hockey, the community cannot come together. Yet there will be members within each community that isn't impacted by the arena at all. For some, Yes, the arena is a place of comfort and inclusion, but for others, it is a site of discomfort and exclusion. I further question these ideologies and discourses that is used in regards to the community arena. Who is represented within the arena and who isn't? The arena is often the site of many community activities, such as figure skating, curling, agricultural societies, community fairs, and so on. Are those involved outside of hockey, but use the arena represented in a part of the decision-making process? As Renee Hess touched on this morning, how are people getting to the arena? Is there public transportation, or is the arena just a space for those who can get there themselves? Does the arena and the urban center have the same nostalgic connection as those in small towns? And surely a community doesn't die without having an arena, but why is it portrayed as such? So as you can see, I mainly just have questions at this point. I'm curious as to the role that Kraft Hockeyville has in creating these communal perceptions of the rural community and the creation of this imagined identity of hockey in Canada. So to come back to this mission statement, I question if Kraft Hockeyville rallies together communities that are all similar, ones that do not seem to question the status quo of hockey, which is executed by rebuilding these same ideologies and discourses that small towns have thrived on for so long. And by doing so, I wonder if the future of hockey in Canada that Kraft is hoping to protect will remain untouched, keeping the symbolic stamp of Canadian-ness that rural communities across Canada have seemingly worked so hard to preserve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madison. And last but not least, we have John Valentine from MacEwan University.
Hello. First, I'd like to give a big thank you to Cheryl, the volunteers, the organizers who have given this opportunity to come together virtually. I'm going to suggest that French Canadian nationalism made hockey much more powerful and popular in Quebec. And then this nationalistic relationship changes in the 1960s and 70s, and we'll talk about that at the very end. But despite the changes, that hockey is still very important in French Canada today. So hockey occupies an important place in the lives of many Canadians, and this interest is particularly strong in French Canada. When I speak about French Canada, I'm mostly focusing on Quebec. However, surveys find the interest is high among Francophones outside Quebec as well. So for example, the Acadians in Atlantic Canada that we've heard about a few times this conference. So I'm going to try and demonstrate to you that hockey is more important in French Canada due to nationalistic reasons than to the rest of Canada in the past as well as today. And I'm going to do that looking at first the evolution of hockey, and then the Montreal Canadiens, then Rocket Richard, sort of as case studies. And then I'm going to try to explain why this importance exists. First off, in Canada, organized sport emerges in Montreal. So not surprisingly, hockey was codified in Montreal with organized rules and games written in the 1870s. The Amateur Hockey Association of Canada was founded in 1886 in Montreal, and the game played a prominent role in Montreal Winter Carnivals, quickly becoming a game that represented the city. Hockey became one of Montreal's most popular pastimes, and there were 10 rinks constructed prior to 1895. And according to Michel Vignon, hockey received more media coverage than any other sport. Despite resistance from the Catholic Church and Francophone elites about the risk of assimilation, according to Guay, hockey's popularity spread among Francophones and soon became the leading winter entertainment for French Canadians. So this interest continues today, right? According to television ratings, hockey is watched in Quebec at a much higher rate than the rest of Canada, although that doesn't break down along linguistic lines. I found this survey in 1962 and found that hockey was more than 8 times more popular than second place football among the French, while among English, football and hockey were equally popular. And this survey, Association of Canadian Studies 2019, found that hockey was followed by 35% of Francophones, and it was chosen the most popular sport by 5 times more people than the second choice football. Hockey was also the sport most likely to be followed by Anglophones, but at 28%, and that was just over 2.5 times more popular than football. And among allophones, you have hockey and basketball almost equal, and then soccer just a little bit behind that. Okay, part two, Montreal Canadiens, formed in 1909 to represent French Canadians and create a rivalry with Anglophone teams. So the Montreal Canadiens aligned itself closely with the Francophone community by utilizing French Canadian players and featuring a team name that reflected French Canadian culture. The team colors, red, white, and blue, are in the French flag, and even the nicknames evolved with nationalist connotations. However, the most powerful attribute reinforcing the representational nature of the team to the community was the players, right? They shared a similar cultural and ethnic background as their fans. So the Montreal Canadiens became the sporting institution most intimately associated with French Canadian identity. So today, this passion that Quebecers have for the Montreal Canadiens is evident by an examination of media coverage. So Influence Communication, which is a Quebec-based media corporation, they have an annual survey that they do, and they've done this for 20 years. So I went back and looked at these annual media surveys for the last 20 years, and I took an average of all the sports media coverage in Quebec, which is what they're sampling in one of their studies. 2/3 of all sports media coverage in the province of Quebec for 12 months of the year is devoted to the Montreal Canadiens. So that's, spring, summer, fall, Montreal Canadiens. In 2015, all 10 of the top sports personalities receiving the most media coverage in Quebec were from the Montreal Canadiens, so 10 out of 10. In 2017, 14 of the top 25 personalities, so that's the majority of entertainers, politicians, athletes, receiving the most media coverage in Quebec. So this majority of the personalities that get the most media coverage in Quebec were from the Montreal Canadiens, right? Similarly, Richelieu and Corey found that young French Canadians still strongly identify with the team. And so strong is this attachment that Ligier and others found that 94% of Quebecers support the Montreal Canadiens. And this includes Anglophones, Allophones, as well as Francophones. Okay, step 3. Look at Richard, who was signed during the Second World War. When they signed him, the Canadiens had not won the Stanley Cup in more than a decade. During the previous 5 seasons, they had finished in the bottom half of the standings, and the team was rumored to be moving due to its awful record. In his first full season, Richard led the Canadiens to the Stanley Cup championship. In his next season, he broke the goal-scoring record, 50 goals in 50 games. Nobody did that again for 36 years. Attendance at the Montreal Forum doubled in just 7 seasons, and the arena needed expanding to accommodate the demand for tickets. Richard quickly became an icon and a political symbol representing French Canadian nationalism, often at odds with League Commissioner Clarence Campbell, an Oxford-educated English Canadian, even decorated with the Order of the British Empire. To many Francophones, interactions with Campbell represented English Canada's dominance over French Canada. In 1955, after an altercation with a referee, Richard was suspended by Commissioner Campbell. As a symbol of French reaction to English dominance, riots erupted in the streets of Montreal, and this is one example of many where Francophones began to fight for more power. Shortly after, you have the Quiet Revolution and the start of the Quebec separatist movement. So today, Richard is still important in Quebec. You have the Maurice Award given annually to the French Canadian Athlete of the Year, and then you also have the Maurice Richard Trophy given to the top goal scorer in the NHL. In a 2004 poll to choose the greatest hockey player, Wayne Gretzky was chosen first in every region of the country except in Quebec, where Richard received twice as many votes as Gretzky. 44 years after his last game, a Quebec poll cited him as one of the top 10 most admired Quebecers in history. And then you had the Canadian Museum of Civilization, which is now called the Canadian Museum of History. They devoted an exhibit to Richard, and there was a conference examining the cultural importance of Richard's life. After his death, 289 of his personal items were auctioned off, including trophies and pictures and paraphernalia. The federal government intervened and purchased 47 items for $600,000 that were deemed culturally important. Even when asked to list the 10 most important items in the entire museum collection, the Canadian Museum of History vice president included a game-worn hockey sweater from Richard. So why this important? We've talked a little bit about the great history in Quebec. We've talked about the Montreal Canadiens, the most successful franchise ever. They were created to attract French Canadian fans. However, in addition to that, in the decades after World War II, when Quebec was more than 80% Francophone, The French controlled less than 20% of the economy, and they were the lowest paid workers in the province. So they faced discrimination. And one reason why hockey became so important to the French is you had it being used as an example where the French could defeat the English, right? The fact that the team represented a marginalized population in its struggles against the more powerful made the attachment more important. The success of the Montreal Canadiens helped disempowered French Canadians feel proud. And icons like Maurice Richard could demonstrate to an underprivileged people that they could still be champions. Richard became a powerful political symbol of nationalism as he stood up for all French Canadians, particularly in newspaper columns, where he accused the League and Campbell of discrimination against Francophones. And he even accused the League of awarding more assists to English players so that they could win the scoring title. Now, French Canadian hadn't won the scoring title for more than 3 decades. So the French media created the idea that Richard and other French Canadian players were discriminated against by the English hockey elite. Eventually, this resulted in the Richard Riot, which was followed by the Quiet Revolution, which changed Quebec society. So today, many suggest, and there's 3 examples listed, that hockey does not have the same meaning in Quebec. One reason is the decline in the French Canadian-ness of the Canadians that started in the 1960s, where you see a decrease in the number of French Canadian players on the Montreal Canadiens, to the point where today you have 0 Quebecers playing on the Montreal Canadiens, and you even have 2 Quebecers playing for the Toronto Raptors, which is quite a switch. If you look at the 1970s, when the Quebec Nordique arrived on the scene, they started to steal the nationalistic component away from the Montreal Canadiens, which changed the nationalistic relationship that the public had with the Canadians. And then finally, the Quebecois went from being a minority in Canada to seeing themselves as a majority in Quebec. And with that transformation came more power. So hockey and the Habs were no longer needed to help a disempowered people feel empowered. So the relationship changed, even though I would still argue that hockey is very important in Quebec. Thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, John, for engaging in an interesting presentation. I'd like to open up the floor now to questions and comments. So if you have one, please go ahead. You can just raise your hand. And
Can I unmute for a couple of questions? Is that okay?
Yes, please.
So Kristi, I enjoyed your presentation, and I saw that you used the painting that I've sometimes used in class to challenge Canadian origin stories. And I think that's a painting from Belgium, which shows hockey being played more than 100 years before it was played in North America. So is that why you chose that painting? And I also have a question for Maddie as well.
I think it's a picture. At least the caption when I pulled it was from Russia, and it was a picture of early bandy from about 100 some odd years ago. But you might be right. I was just looking for, something to sort of highlight the idea that the game has a long history, both in Canada but also in Europe. We've played stick games on ice for a long, long time, and perhaps if we asked some of my Indigenous colleagues, perhaps since time immemorial.
Great.
So,
okay,
yeah.
Thank you. Maddie, you underlined the word protect, and you did touch upon this a little bit in your presentation, but I think you could do a whole presentation just on the use of that word protecting hockey. What do you think Kraft is getting at there?
Thanks for your question. Yeah, I agree. I think I need to unpack that a lot further. Again, still trying to figure out what I'm going to be doing for my project, but I think trying to protect is a crazy word in itself. But I think what they might be trying to get at is preserving this idea of what hockey is, and that it stays in small towns. It's rooted in a hockeyville, and that's how they want to keep it. Is this idea that hockey is established in these small towns, this kind of perception that's reproduced over and over again. But like I mentioned, it's not there as much anymore. Hockey doesn't live in small towns as it used to. So I think just still trying to put forward these perceptions and ideas that hockey is still a small town thing. But yeah, I'm excited to hopefully learn more about what they're trying to protect.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. I also have a question for Madison, and I wanted to talk a little bit about Elsie Booktook and you know, you're like, if Kraft Hockeyville is about producing a particular notion of who plays and who's privileged. And I know that Elsie Booktook hasn't happened yet, so we can't know for sure, but what kinds of meaning making and difference do you think might be produced by locating Kraft Hockeyville in a First Nation such as the one here? And are you going to come here and do this work? And if you are, you should look me up when you come.
Thanks for your question. Yes, I mean, I hopefully once COVID and we're allowed to travel, I would love to get into the communities. I think one of my goals or one of my methods is try to visit the top 5 or the past 5 years winning competitions and just get into the communities and see, kind of try to answer my questions. But yeah, I'm not exactly sure what to look for, how it might be different, considering it is the first First Nations and Indigenous community that has one. I'm not really sure how it will align or what it will look like in comparison to the previous or even my experience of my neighboring town. So yeah, I don't really know what to expect, and I think it will be a cool and exciting time to kind of explore that.
Yes, definitely. I think it's going to be it'll be an interesting, I think, version of Kraft Hockeyville. I'm hoping to get there too. Do we have any questions for our presenters today? If you do, you can just unmute and go ahead. Jamie, yes, go ahead.
Hi, wonderful presentations by everyone. I really enjoyed this. I thought it was a very wonderful panel. My question is for Kristi. Your talk was about hegemony, but then I know a lot of your work in the past has been on masculinity and hypermasculinity. So I was wondering if, and perhaps this question's a bit too obvious, but do you see a connection between sort of hegemonic hockey masculinity and hegemonic nationalism? And again, it might be very obvious, but again, big fan of your work, and I just want to hear more.
Oh, that's really kind. Thank you, Jamie. Yeah, I do. And I think I've I think in my previous work, tried to highlight some of these connections that, you know, following, I think, from important scholarship by Mary Louise Adams and others, that when we kind of describe Canada as hockey, we're talking about a particular kind of hockey, and what exists in the Canadian imagination tends to be this kind of white, able-bodied, masculine, the hockey played by cis straight men. And I think that that's important. And I think looking at the various ways, and I think one of the ways into this paper today, I mean, one of the ways this paper could have gone was looking at the challenges by other non-hegemonic others, women, queer folk. My new work is on the old and the very old and their participation in hockey, and the way that hockey, disability, age kind of intersect to produce new ways of imagining Canada and the Canadian nation in ways that are often marginalized, but I think pose really exciting and interesting challenges to what we see. And I think it's important to pay not only attention to the fact that like these privileged identities are being produced here, but there's also outside of these hegemonic ideals, there's really exciting and interesting things happening. And I think as scholars, we also need to find ways to celebrate the kind of good stuff that's happening in hockey, as well as talk about some of the challenges that are going on, some of the things we want to be better. Oh, I hope that that's an animal, but I'm yes. Hello, kitty. And so I think there's definitely a relationship between hockey, Canadian hockey nationalism and its hegemonic kind of space, and the fact that it's often particular kinds of men. And we see this in other kind of national spaces. So if we think about the celebration of the Canadian military, we're often looking at similar kinds of bodies. When we look at other kinds of sports that are widely celebrated, we often see in these national symbols that we come to celebrate similar kinds of people over and over again. And so I think it's important to not only place the spotlight there, but to look at how other kinds of folk challenge this space. Thank you, Jamie, for that question.
I have a question for Kristi. When you were working on some of the components for your presentation, did you notice how the various Indigenous associations have started to use hockey as ways to reclaim a space for Indigenous children to participate, and the development of allowing the girls to now play on a competitive level? Because I know there's a couple different associations that are sponsoring hockey games / championships / ways to showcase their talents. And I was wondering, since that is a really interesting approach to bringing it to their space and claim it in their terms, and I was wondering if there's probably lots of terminology that can be used for those scenarios, but have you noticed patterns in terms of how other groups participating in hockey are able to claim the space as their own?
Yeah, I haven't looked at a lot at Indigenous girls, but one of the things I will say in the work I've done here is that, and I think one of the presenters yesterday was sort of talking about this, that there's a difference between elite level hockey and community hockey, particularly in Indigenous communities. And I know Michael found this in his work as well, is that these kind of intergenerational spaces are really interesting, where people play with what they have, they play with the equipment they have, that you might have elders playing with children, men, women, people of all genders playing together on the ice at the same time. We think about how the ways the rationalization of sport privileges sport for some and marginalizes sport for others, and that there are lots of different ways to organize hockey participation. And I think we've seen this, and Michael's work really points to that, as well as some of the presentations over the course of this weekend as well, that some Indigenous communities have brought entirely different meanings to hockey through this lack of kind of stifling, competitive, elite level, rationalized sport. And this isn't to say that some Indigenous people don't choose that stream, but just that there are other kinds of streams, which is things that I've also seen in my in the ethnographic work I've been doing with very old hockey players like in their 70s and 80s. But I think Mila, it's really interesting to think about how Indigenous women's hockey might be produced differently. I know that there's been some interesting work done by Downey on lacrosse and women's lacrosse and the creation of the Haudenosaunee national team, but I'm more familiar with that work than I am with the work on hockey, unfortunately. I'm sorry, but thank you.